Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true adult horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. Whispers in the Rain. You ever have one of those mornings where everything just feels off? Like you're going through the motions, doing all the normal stuff, but something's not right, and you can't put your finger on it? That's exactly how my day started. It was around 5 a.m., dark and quiet except for the rain outside tapping against the windows. I was in the kitchen, chopping up some veggies to make a quick breakfast. It's part of my routine, and usually, I enjoy the quiet time in the morning before everything gets noisy and hectic. But for some reason, that morning felt different. It wasn't anything obvious. I didn't hear anything weird or see anything strange at first. Just this weird feeling that I couldn't shake. I thought maybe I was just tired, so I brushed it off and kept going. Then, as I was reaching for the salt, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The drawer beside me, the one where I keep all the knives, had opened just a crack. Now, normally, I wouldn't think twice about something like that. Drawers get left open a little all the time, right? But I was sure I hadn't touched that one yet. In fact, I hadn't even been near it. Still, I didn't think much of it at the time, and just nudged it closed with my hip. But here's the thing. The second I turned my back, I heard this loud, almost painful slam behind me. It was so sudden that I jumped, and I swear it was like someone had shut the drawer with all their strength. My ears were ringing a bit from the sound, and it felt like the whole house had just held its breath. Now, here's where it gets weird. I didn't really have a logical reason to be scared at that point, but for some reason, I felt frozen, like my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't even bring myself to look over my shoulder at the drawer for a good 10 seconds. I just stared at the kitchen counter, hands gripping the edge, trying to shake off the sudden rush of whatever that feeling was. After a while, I finally worked up the nerve to look, and of course the drawer was shut tight, just sitting there like nothing had happened. I tried to laugh it off, maybe even convince myself that I was just imagining things. But here's the thing. When you're alone in your kitchen that early, with only the rain outside, you start to notice every little detail, and I was sure that slam had been real. I figured maybe the drawer was loose or something, so I checked it. I pulled it open and shut it a few times to see if it would slam again, but nothing happened. The drawer moved smoothly, without a hitch. So, what was that slam? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just one of those things that happen sometimes, like when a window's open and a draft pushes things around. But the windows were all shut tight, and the house was completely still, except for that rain tapping outside. I tried to shake it off, but that slamming drawer kept nagging at me. It's funny how your mind can turn the smallest things into a big deal, right? I'm usually not the type to get rattled by something as simple as a drawer slamming shut. But standing there alone, with that weird tension in the air, well, it felt different. I could almost feel it sticking to me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself to keep going. I just had to keep moving, get breakfast done, and forget about it. But then, as I went to crack an egg over the pan, I noticed something else. Something small but strange. My phone, which I had set down on the counter next to the stovetop, was now over by the sink, just sitting there. Now, I know I hadn't moved it. I hadn't even touched it since I came into the kitchen. And it wasn't just a few inches from where I left it. It was a good foot or two away, just lying there as if someone had picked it up and casually placed it by the sink. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to piece together how it could have ended up there. I know it sounds like nothing, but in that moment it felt like everything. I took a deep breath and forced myself to reach for it, picking it up and checking for missed calls or messages. Anything that could make it feel normal again. Nothing. Just the usual clock staring back at me. 5:12 a.m. So now I was really starting to feel weird, like maybe I was losing it a bit. I mean, what else could explain all these little things? A drawer slamming shut by itself, my phone moving across the counter. There's such small details, but when they're all happening at once and you're alone in the house, it starts to mess with you. I tried to ignore it, tried to finish cooking breakfast, acting like everything was fine. But that uneasy feeling kept gnawing at me. Every little creak and pop from the house sounded louder, sharper, and I could have sworn that the shadows in the corners of the kitchen were darker than usual. I don't know how else to put it. It was like the light wasn't reaching into the corners the way it normally did, and it made the kitchen feel smaller, like it was closing in around me. Then I heard it, just the faintest sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the hallway that led to the stairs. It wasn't anything clear, just a low, almost mumbling sound, like someone talking to themselves. I froze, listening, straining to hear if it was really there, or just my mind playing tricks on me. The rain outside picked up, drumming harder against the windows, but I could still make out that soft, muffled sound. My stomach knotted up, and my hands were sweating as I stood there, staring at the doorway that led to the hallway. I don't know why, but every instinct was telling me not to go check, just to stay put, to keep my eyes fixed on the kitchen counter and pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But that's when the mumbling stopped, and there was this silence. The kind of silence that isn't really silent, if you know what I mean. Like the air was holding its breath, waiting. And then, right out of that silence, I heard my own name, clear as day. Just a whisper, right by my ear. Hey. It wasn't like a friend calling you from across the room. It was soft, almost gentle, like someone was leaning close, trying not to startle me, just saying my name. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there, half expecting it anyway, but of course there was no one, just the empty kitchen behind me, and the faint reflection of my own face in the window over the sink, looking as freaked out as I felt. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out more like a shaky breath. You're just tired, I told myself. Too much caffeine, maybe, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. And the worst part was, I had no idea what it was or why it was happening. I finished making breakfast in a hurry, barely even tasting it. My appetite was gone, replaced by this anxious energy that wouldn't leave. I wanted to go upstairs, maybe lie down and try to shake this off, but some part of me felt glued to that kitchen, like leaving would make things worse. Like if I turned my back, something would follow me. And then, as if to answer my thoughts, I heard another sound. This one was soft, barely there, but unmistakable, the distinct creak of a floorboard. But not just any floorboard. It was the one by the front door, the one that always squeaks whenever someone comes inside. I held my breath, listening, waiting to hear if it would happen again. But nothing came, just silence, and the steady beat of the rain outside. At that point, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, clutched it like it was some kind of lifeline, and started towards the stairs, practically running up them two at a time. I didn't even look back. I just wanted to get away from that kitchen, from whatever was happening down there. When I got to my bedroom, I shut the door behind me and leaned against it, heart pounding. The silence felt thicker somehow, like the whole house was listening. And then I heard it, the creak of that same floorboard down by the front door, but closer this time. I stood there in my bedroom, every muscle tense, just listening. I knew every sound my house made, but that creak wasn't one of them. It was the kind of noise you'd only hear if someone heavy was shifting their weight, slowly making their way across the floor. And each new creak was just a little closer. I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling, that the rain was messing with the wood. But deep down, I knew better. I clutched my phone, half thinking about calling someone, but who would I call? And what would I say? Hey, I think my house is creaking. I didn't even know how to explain it. And I didn't want anyone to think I was losing it. But the creaking kept going, each sound closer than the last. I counted the spaces in my head, how many steps it would take to get from the front door to the bottom of the stairs. I'd done it 100 times myself, I knew it wasn't far. And if that creaking was moving where I thought it was, that meant whoever or whatever was in my house was now at the foot of the stairs. The next sound sent a chill right through me. The slow, deliberate creak of a step on the staircase. I felt rooted in place, my back pressed against the door. I couldn't bring myself to open it, to check, to see if maybe, just maybe, I was imagining it all. Instead, I found myself counting each step as I heard them, one by one, making their way up the stairs, coming closer and closer to where I was standing. 1, 2, 3. My brain was racing, calculating how long I had before whatever was making its way up those stairs would reach me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, paralyzed, knowing I should do something, but unable to make myself move. The footsteps continued, each one slow, deliberate, like whoever was there wanted me to hear every single one. For 5, 6, I tried to steady my breathing, tried to calm myself down, but I felt like I was barely holding it together. 7, 8, 9. Then there was a pause. Silence. Nothing. It stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, listening, waiting, expecting the door to burst open at any second. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. A minute passed, then another. I started to wonder if it was over, if maybe I'd imagined it. I began to let out a shaky breath, just as I heard the faintest sound of someone or something breathing on the other side of the door. It was soft, barely there, but unmistakable. At that point, every survival instinct kicked in. I turned, fumbling with the lock, practically falling backward as I stumbled away from the door. I grabbed my phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. But as I hit the call button, the phone screen flickered and then went dark. I stared at it, disbelieving, pressing buttons, trying to get it to turn back on. Nothing. My only connection to the outside world was gone. Then, from behind the door, I heard my name, soft, barely above a whisper, but somehow I knew it was directed at me. "Hey, let me in," it whispered. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a sound. It was the voice of someone I knew, or rather, someone I used to know. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me as I realized it sounded exactly like my friend Mark. The same Mark who'd passed away 3 years ago. "Come on," the voice urged again, a little louder this time. It was Mark's voice, without a doubt, but there was something off about it. The tone was strange, too flat, like he was trying to act casual but missing the right emotions. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't Mark. It couldn't be. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could think, the knob began to rattle, slowly at first, then harder, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was getting impatient. I felt trapped, helpless, like a cornered animal. The only escape was the window, but I was on the second floor, and the thought of jumping out into the dark, rain-soaked night made my stomach churn. And then the rattling stopped. Silence fell again, thick and heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. For a second, I thought maybe I was safe, that whatever was there had given up. But then, slowly, the door started to creak open. I felt like I was in slow motion, my feet barely able to move as I scrambled to the corner of the room, putting as much distance between me and the door as I could. But when it finally swung open, no one was there. Just the empty hallway stretching out in front of me. Relief washed over me, mixed with a deep, unsettling confusion. There was no one outside my door. Nothing. But as I stepped forward, cautiously peering into the hallway, I saw something on the floor, something small and dark, sitting right in the middle of the doorway. It was a photograph, old and worn, like it had been through years of handling. I bent down, hesitating before I picked it up. The image was blurry, faded, but I could just make out two people standing side by side in front of a house that looked disturbingly familiar. I squinted, trying to make out their faces, and that's when I realized who they were. It was me and Mark, from years ago, standing in front of my own house. But I had no memory of that picture. None. And in the photo, Mark was staring straight at the camera with a wide grin. But his eyes looked wrong, hollow, as though they weren't really looking at anything at all. A chill ran down my spine, and I dropped the photo like it had burned me. I backed away, stumbling into the wall behind me, as something caught my eye, a movement at the end of the hallway. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat, and saw a shadow standing there, just at the edge of the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I blinked, and in that split second it vanished. I ran, blindly stumbling back into my bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. I didn't care if it was all in my head. I just wanted to get away. I pressed myself against the door, sinking down to the floor, my heart racing as I tried to steady my breathing. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. I couldn't tell. But eventually, as the first light of dawn began to creep in through the window, the tension started to fade. The house was quiet again, the rain had stopped, and everything felt normal, like it had all been a dream. But when I got up to open the door, that photograph was still lying there in the doorway. And this time I noticed something else. Scrawled on the back, in what looked like faint scratches, were the words, "I'm still here." The morning light seemed too bright, too ordinary. The sun filtering through the blinds, the quiet hum of the world starting to stir outside. Everything felt wrong. My mind raced, replaying the events from the night before, as though I were stuck in some kind of loop. I couldn't shake the image of that photo, the words on the back of it. "I'm still here." They kept echoing in my mind, drowning out everything else. The house felt too quiet now. The familiar creaks and groans of the floorboards, the soft hiss of the radiator, the murmur of traffic far off in the distance. It all seemed so distant, so hollow. I stepped carefully to the door. The image of the photo burned into my thoughts. It was still there, lying just where I dropped it. I bent down to pick it up, feeling the cold edge of it in my hand. The photograph seemed more worn now than it had been the night before, its edges curling, the picture itself darker, more muddled. I flipped it over, bracing myself for what I might see. The words, "I'm still here," were still there, scratched into the back. But something had changed. The words were growing, like someone had continued to scratch them in, layer after layer. Over time, there was a new line beneath it. More words that hadn't been there before. "I never left." A cold wave of dread washed over me. I stumbled back, my legs giving out, and I collapsed onto the floor. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't want to think. I just wanted to be anywhere but here. But as I lay there, trying to catch my breath, I heard it again. That whisper. Soft but so close it made my skin crawl. "Let me in." I froze. The voice, it was unmistakable. It was Mark. But Mark was dead. He had died in that car accident. He'd been gone for years. I had seen his funeral with my own eyes. And yet, here it was, as if he had never left, as if he was calling me again, pleading with me to let him in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I stood, shaking, my hand gripping the doorframe for support. I wasn't going to open it. I couldn't. But then the house shifted again. The temperature dropped. It wasn't just the cold of the early morning air. It was a biting cold that sank into your bones. The floor beneath me creaked, like someone was moving through the house. Slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably. I turned toward the hallway, every sense alert, every hair on the back of my neck standing up. The footsteps were softer now, muffled, as if whoever, or whatever, was moving through the house was trying to hide, trying to be quiet. But I could hear them, coming closer. The whispering was still there, but now it was a chorus of voices. They weren't just calling my name anymore. There were others too, voices that didn't sound like Mark. They were like echoes, distant but clear, each one layered on top of the other, each one growing louder and more frantic. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, my body shaking with a mix of fear and disbelief. I tried to tell myself this wasn't happening, that I was imagining it. But the sound of the footsteps was undeniable. They were coming closer. I could hear them outside my room now, the shuffling of something heavy against the floor, a dragging sound, something being pulled across the wood. I was paralyzed. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, anything, but my body refused to cooperate. I was trapped in this house, with whatever was tormenting me, whatever had never left. The whispers reached a crescendo, all of them now calling my name, pleading, demanding. "Let me in." I finally mustered enough strength to make it to the window, my hands trembling as I slid open the pane. The rain had started again, the steady downpour filling the silence with its drumming rhythm. The world outside seemed so calm, so unaffected by the terror I was experiencing inside. I stared out into the night, my heart racing. I thought about jumping, about running, about escaping from this house that had once been my home but now felt like a prison. But before I could make a decision, I heard it, a loud bang, followed by a series of footsteps, stomping, heavy and quick, coming up the stairs. There was no mistaking it now. Something was here. Something was in my house, and it was getting closer. I turned, frantic, but when I looked back at the door, it was ajar. Just slightly, but enough to know it had been opened. I crept toward it, my pulse pounding in my ears, each step feeling like an eternity. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was waiting on the other side. But when I reached the doorway, there was nothing, just the empty hallway. No footsteps, no sounds. I stepped into the hallway cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had to know. I had to know what was going on, what was happening to me, and to this house. I had to understand why I couldn't escape. That's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, in the dim light from the window, I saw a shadow. It wasn't solid, more like a distortion, a figure moving just out of focus, flickering in and out of sight like it was trying to hide from me. But there was no mistaking it. It was standing there, watching me, its head tilted in an unsettlingly unnatural way. I froze again, my eyes locked on the shadow, my breath caught in my throat. The voice, the whispers grew louder again, surrounding me, filling my mind, telling me to come closer, to follow. But something in me snapped. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it toward the shadow. It collided with something hard, but the figure didn't move. Instead, the shadow flickered, and then suddenly, it wasn't just one figure. It was a dozen, all of them emerging from the darkness, from the walls, from the air itself. They were swirling, moving closer and closer, their faces, no, their features distorted and wrong, like they were barely holding onto their form. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world around me spun out of control, the shadows growing larger, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, shouting in unison, tearing at my sanity. "Let me in," they all screamed at once. "Let me in." And then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shadows vanished. The voices disappeared. The air returned to its normal, stale quiet. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, as if nothing had happened at all. The house was silent, still. But when I looked down, I saw it. The photograph. It was back in my hand, the words on the back still etched in deep, jagged scratches. "I'm still here. I never left. I'm with you." And that was when I knew. It wasn't just Mark. It wasn't just a voice in my head. This was something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for me, something that had been in the walls all along. I didn't know how long I stayed there, staring at the photo, but when I finally looked up, the house felt different. It felt colder, darker, as if the very air had changed. And in the distance, from the deepest part of the house, I heard the faintest whisper, "Let me in." And this time, I didn't think I could ignore it anymore. I couldn't run. There was nowhere to hide. Story 2, The House That Never Lets Go. Have you ever had one of those nights where you're lying in bed, wide awake, and start asking yourself, what if I never fall asleep again? That's how it all started for me. Just me, lying there in the dark, listening to the rain on the roof, trying to relax and not feel like the weight of everything was pressing down on my chest. But the harder I tried to calm down, the more awake I felt, and the more the silence of my new house started to feel heavy. I guess a little background might help explain where I was coming from. My name is Claire, and well, I'm not going to say I've had an easy year. I'm in my 40s, freshly divorced, and just moved to this tiny, rain-soaked town hoping for a fresh start. Moving wasn't really a choice so much as the only option left. The divorce didn't go smoothly, and after it was finalized, I just wanted to get as far away as possible from the memories that kept creeping into my head every night. So I ended up here, in this creaky old house with more character than comfort, if you know what I mean. It's funny, I was looking forward to the rain at first. I thought it would be relaxing, like something to help me sleep. But when you're alone, in an unfamiliar house, with only the sound of rain and a restless mind, there's something almost unsettling about it. I can't be the only one who's felt that way, right? Anyway, I figured I'd try recording myself telling stories, just for something to do, thinking it might quiet my mind enough to let me drift off. And for a while, it was kind of working. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. And I don't mean in some ghostly footsteps way. No, it was much subtler than that. Little things that were almost easy to ignore. But I couldn't ignore them for long. Let me tell you, it started with the strangest feeling, like I was never alone when I was recording, like someone was listening. But, of course, I dismissed it, told myself it was just stress and exhaustion. I didn't want to feel crazy, sitting there talking into my phone in an empty room, convinced I was being watched. And yet, every night as I tried to record, I felt like someone was just there, listening quietly. You might wonder, why didn't I just stop? Well, at first, I thought I was helping myself. I felt a little less lonely, telling stories from my life, almost as if someone was really listening. I even told some embarrassing stories, things I'd never tell anyone else. I thought it was therapeutic, but it didn't stay like that for long, because then I started hearing things on the recordings, things I knew I hadn't said. So, it started with the recordings. That's what really threw me. You'd think I'd have noticed right away, but honestly, it was subtle at first. There'd be these tiny, almost inaudible sounds, like a low hum, or maybe a faint static. I thought it was just my phone glitching, and I didn't pay it much attention. But one night, when I played back the recording, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but it was there. There was this sigh, this deep, low sigh, that wasn't mine. I froze. I remember sitting there in the dark, the rain drumming against the windows, just listening to that sigh over and over. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't even that clear, but the weirdest part was how sad it sounded. Almost like someone was on the other side of the phone, just breathing and waiting. I didn't want to overthink it, though. I'm not the type to jump to conclusions, you know? I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd accidentally made the sound myself. I was stressed, exhausted. Maybe I'd just forgotten about it. So I kept recording, night after night, telling more stories, mostly random memories. Some were funny, some were heavy, but I always chose things I didn't mind hearing back. It felt like therapy, in a way, but then things got weirder. I'd tell a story and play it back the next day, and I'd hear these noises in the background. Faint little sounds that shouldn't have been there, like whispers or faint clicking sounds. I tried ignoring it, thinking maybe I was just tired, but the more I listened, the more certain I was. It wasn't just background noise. It was like someone else was there, saying something I couldn't quite make out. I remember one night in particular. It had been raining harder than usual, the kind of rain that rattles the windows and makes you feel like the whole house is shifting. I was recording, just talking about my day, and for some reason, I felt this weird urge to tell a story from years ago. I never talked about it before, not to anyone, but it just came out. It was about the time my ex and I almost split up years before the divorce, a low point in my life, honestly. But as I spoke, I noticed something strange. Every time I paused, it was like there was another sound filling the silence. Just this barely there murmur, soft and muffled, but answering me. It was like someone was commenting on my story, their voice blending in with the rain. It was so faint I thought I was imagining it. But when I played it back, I could swear I heard someone whisper, "I know." I hit pause and just sat there, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to throw the phone across the room. I felt this rush of cold run through me, like I just dipped my hand in ice water. I knew I hadn't said it, but there was a faint, almost mocking, "I know." Who was listening? It's hard to explain, but it felt personal, like someone was listening who knew me, who'd been waiting for me to say something like that. I tried to laugh it off, but as the nights went on, the feeling only got stronger. And then, things around the house started feeling off. One night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was completely alone. I'd lock the doors and windows, check the rooms, tell myself it was just nerves. But every time I started recording, it felt like someone else was in the room with me. You know that feeling when someone stands too close behind you? How you can almost feel their breath, feel the weight of their gaze on the back of your neck. That's how it felt every night I recorded. And then, things started moving. I'd set something down like my keys or my phone, and come back to find them in a different spot. I thought I was being forgetful. I mean, I'm not exactly on top of things these days. But then it happened with bigger stuff. My chair would be shifted a few inches away from my desk, or my shoes would be lined up by the door, even though I never put them there. It was like someone was tidying up after me, arranging things just so. I tried asking the neighbors about the house. Just small talk, you know? I mentioned it in that casual way, like, "Hey, have you ever heard anything weird about this place?" But people around here, they get this look. I'd mention the house, and their faces would go blank, like they didn't want to talk about it. Or worse, they'd pretend not to hear me. One woman even told me that house has been empty for years, which didn't make sense because I'd only just moved in. But she said it so matter-of-factly, like it was just a fact everyone knew. I tried to brush it off. I told myself, it's just your imagination. It's just the stress. But there was this one night that I can't forget. I was recording as usual, talking about some story from my childhood. I just hit pause, and then, as clear as day, I heard my own voice whisper back to me, "I've been waiting. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just pack up and leave?" Believe me, the thought crossed my mind more times than I can count. But it's funny, the more strange things happened, the more I felt this pull, like I couldn't just walk away. I had to understand what was going on, even if part of me knew it wasn't going to be something I wanted to hear. I started recording every night, like clockwork. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, press record, and just start talking. I told myself it was for my insomnia, that maybe if I kept talking about my day, I'd eventually find some peace. But that wasn't it. Not really. I was hoping I'd catch something to explain the whispers, the sighs, the strange sounds. I became obsessed, replaying each recording, dissecting every second of audio for the slightest hint of something otherworldly. Then came the night I decided to tell the story about my grandmother. I don't know why. Maybe I was running out of things to say, or maybe I just felt nostalgic. My grandma and I had been close. and when she passed away, I remember feeling this immense emptiness. She was the kind of person who believed in things like spirits and signs from the afterlife. And she'd always say, "Pay attention to what's around you, Claire. Sometimes the world's trying to tell you something." I remember feeling strange as I spoke, like the air in the room got heavier. The rain was coming down hard, just hammering the roof, and I could barely hear myself over the sound. But I kept talking, telling stories about Grandma, how she'd light candles for good spirits and leave little offerings on her windowsill. When I hit pause, I felt a chill run down my spine. I almost didn't want to play it back, but of course I did, and that's when I heard it. Right there in the recording, clear as day. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a voice, her voice, so familiar it stopped my heart. Just one word, but it was enough to make every hair on my body stand on end. Claire. It was soft, almost tender, like she was calling me from across the room. I rewound it over and over, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. But no matter how many times I played it, the voice was still there. I thought I was losing my mind. How could my grandmother's voice be on that recording? She'd been gone for years. I remember sitting there in the dark, clutching my phone, listening to that one word over and over until I could barely breathe. I started asking myself questions, crazy ones. Was someone playing a trick on me? But who would go through all that trouble just to mess with me? And even if someone had, how could they know details about my life that I'd never told anyone? And then, the more I thought about it, the more I started to wonder if maybe Grandma had been right all along. But it didn't stop there. The next night, I couldn't resist recording again. I was too shaken to talk about Grandma. So I just started telling a story about my kids, something light, something safe. But halfway through, there was this tapping sound in the background. I almost stopped talking right then and there, but I pushed through, thinking it was just the rain. When I played it back, though, I heard the tapping again. Only this time it was loud, like someone was drumming their fingers right next to the microphone. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't tapping, I was just sitting there staring at the wall, but there was this relentless tapping, and underneath it, barely audible, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A faint voice, so quiet I could only make it out with my ear pressed to the phone, repeating, "Help me, help me." I couldn't move. I sat there for what felt like hours, just listening to that desperate plea over and over. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who it was, or what it wanted, or if I was finally losing my mind. But there was one thing I was sure of. I wasn't alone in that house. And whoever, or whatever, was there with me, they wanted something. The next few nights, I barely slept. I stopped recording, too terrified to hear what might come through the speaker. But things didn't stop just because I put the phone away. In fact, they got worse. I'd be lying in bed, eyes shut tight, pretending I was somewhere else, anywhere else, and I'd hear it. Footsteps. Just soft, barely their footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I'd open my eyes, expecting to see my kids standing there, or maybe even my ex coming to check on me. But the hallway would be empty. One night, I mustered up the courage to get out of bed and check. I tiptoed into the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake the whole neighborhood. But as soon as I stepped into the dark, I felt this freezing chill, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. I could see my breath, fogging up in the air, and that's when I heard it again. That voice, so close it felt like it was right beside me. "Claire." I turned and ran back into my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat on the floor, back pressed against the door, clutching my knees to my chest. I didn't know what to do, who to call. How do you explain something like that without sounding insane? But the worst part, the next morning, I found a note in my kitchen, scrawled on a piece of paper I knew I hadn't left out. It was messy, like someone had written it in a hurry, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my grandmother's, and all it said was, "Leave." I stared at that note for a long time, my hands shaking. It didn't make sense. My grandmother had been gone for years, and yet here was her handwriting, clear as day, warning me to get out. But I didn't know where to go, what to do, and despite everything, I felt tethered to that house, like leaving wasn't even an option anymore. I sat in my kitchen, staring at that note. It was impossible. I thought this couldn't really be happening. I even considered the idea that maybe I'd written it myself in some sort of sleepwalking episode. But the handwriting was so clearly hers, shaky, slanted in that familiar way, that I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The word was simple, leave, but the more I looked at it, the more it felt like a command, like she wasn't just suggesting it. She was pleading with me. Or worse, she was telling me that if I didn't go, something else would happen. The note threw me into a spiral, and that night I decided to reach out to the one person who might know something. My neighbor, Mrs. Wallace, a retired schoolteacher who had lived on the same street her whole life. She had a reputation for knowing every bit of history about the town, and while she was always polite, she'd been unusually cold toward me since I'd moved in. But I didn't care. I needed answers. I went over to her place, an old house similar to mine. She seemed surprised to see me when she opened the door, but after a few minutes, she invited me in. I took a deep breath and decided to get straight to the point. "Mrs. Wallace," I said, "I have to ask you something about the house. Do you know anything about it? Anything strange?" Her face darkened immediately. She put down her tea and looked me straight in the eyes. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice low. I told her about the strange sounds, the notes, the feeling of not being alone. Her expression changed from skepticism to something almost like pity. She took a deep breath and told me the story in a flat, detached tone, as though she didn't want to relive it. The house had once belonged to a woman named Evelyn Monroe. Evelyn, a single mother, had moved there in the 1950s with her daughter, Margaret. According to Mrs. Wallace, Evelyn was known to be troubled. She was often seen pacing the front porch at night, mumbling to herself. The townsfolk said she was unstable, that she had visions, and would go on about hearing voices in the house, things she claimed were warning her about a danger she couldn't see. But no one took her seriously, and they began to avoid her, thinking she was mentally ill. Then one night, the voices told her to leave. Mrs. Wallace's voice grew quieter as she recounted the last night anyone saw Evelyn and her daughter. The next morning, the house was empty, their possessions still scattered as though they'd vanished mid-sentence. No one knew what had happened to them, and while some speculated that Evelyn had finally lost it and run off with her daughter, others were less certain. Rumors started to circulate about what happened in that house. Some claimed that Evelyn's spirit still lingered, trapped, reliving those final, haunting moments over and over again. I felt the blood drain from my face. Evelyn's story mirrored mine so closely it was chilling. Mrs. Wallace leaned in, her face somber. "Claire," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it isn't safe there. People who live in that house, well, let's just say they don't stay long. They can't." I went back to my house that night with every intention of packing up and leaving the next day. But once I got back inside, I felt something, a strange calm, almost as if the house itself was convincing me to stay. It sounds crazy, but it was like I was glued there, like I couldn't physically bring myself to leave. Against every instinct screaming at me to get out, I stayed. That night, I tried to sleep, thinking it might be my last in that house. But my insomnia was worse than ever, and I finally picked up my phone to record again, as if capturing my voice might help ground me somehow. I hit record, took a deep breath, and started talking. I don't even remember what I said, but I felt something cold brush against my arm as I spoke, like someone had run their fingers down my skin. The air grew thick, like I was submerged in water, and I could feel the room shift, becoming darker, colder. Suddenly, the rain outside grew louder, almost deafening, and then I heard it. That same voice from before, a woman's voice this time, faint, and pleading. "Help, please, help us." I froze. My mouth went dry as I played the recording back, but this time, the voice was clearer than ever. And it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, as if they were trying to speak over each other, each one desperate to be heard. I could hear Evelyn's voice, her fear and desperation echoing across decades. And then, layered beneath it, I heard my own name. "Claire, you have to leave." Panic surged through me. I bolted out of bed, grabbing my car keys, but as I reached the front door, something stopped me. The air grew icy, and I heard footsteps slowly coming down the stairs. They were deliberate, almost cautious, as if whoever, or whatever, was moving didn't want to scare me too soon. I could hear the creak of each step, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. Then, the footsteps stopped right behind me. I felt a presence, cold and consuming, like an endless void. I couldn't move, and then I heard it again, right by my ear, so close it was like the breath was freezing into my skin. "I told you, you can't leave." That was it. I tore out of the house, leaving everything behind. I drove straight to a motel and didn't look back. I didn't care if I was running from nothing. I couldn't spend another second in that place. The next day, I went back, hoping to gather some of my things, but when I opened the door, the house was empty. I'm not talking about my things being packed up or moved out. I mean, it was completely bare, as if no one had lived there at all. Every last trace of my life, of Evelyn's life, of anything that had ever happened there, was gone. Just an empty, silent shell. I didn't ask questions. I didn't try to get an explanation. I got back in my car, left town, and never looked back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that house or what became of Evelyn and her daughter. All I know is that the place has a hold on people, a darkness that reaches out and sinks its claws in, and once it does, it doesn't let go. Months later, I heard they'd sold the place to another family, someone looking for a fresh start just like I was. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to stay away, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd find out soon enough. As for me, I still have trouble sleeping, and every now and then, in the dead of night, I think I hear that voice calling to me again, a whisper just faint enough to make me doubt my own sanity. "Claire, come back." Story 3. The Watcher of Maple Hill. You know that feeling when you're dead certain you're being watched? I mean, you just feel it. Not like a quick glance, or someone looking at you on the street. No, this was different. Like an itch at the back of your neck that wouldn't go away, even when you were alone. That's what it was like for Karen from the moment she moved into her new place in Maple Hill. And as she'd soon find out, sometimes those feelings aren't all in your head. Karen was a close friend of mine, and I remember how excited she was to get that house. She just finalized her divorce after years of putting it off, and getting out of the city was something she had dreamed of for a while. Maple Hill seemed like the perfect spot, and I thought so too. It was quiet, a nice little place out of the way, but still close enough to shops and stuff she needed. Houses that were well kept, lawns neat, all that pleasant suburb vibe, you know? But it wasn't even a month before she called me up, voice kind of shaky, saying she thought she'd made a huge mistake moving there. I tried to tell her it was probably just stress. New place, new life, those things weigh on a person. But she wasn't buying it. She started saying things like she felt like someone was watching her, especially at night. I thought maybe she was just still adjusting, maybe even a little lonely. But the thing is, Karen wasn't the type to get spooked easily. So, when she started talking about this weird light that would flash on and off across the street every night, always at the same time, I began to wonder if something was really off. It was this house, directly across from hers. The light would blink on and off, in sync with her own bedroom light. At first, she thought it might just be a neighbor's weird quirk, or maybe some electrical glitch. But it happened like clockwork every night. Karen being Karen, she decided to check it out herself. I'll be honest, I thought it was funny at the time, imagining her in her slippers, trying to investigate her neighbor. But when she went up to the house, it looked completely empty. Like, no furniture, no signs of anyone living there. She called me afterward, sounding half convinced it was her imagination. But the way she described it, standing there in the rain, looking through those dark windows, waiting for any sign of life, it gave me the chills. It was quiet, too quiet, and she said the whole neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. She started asking me questions I didn't know how to answer. "Do you think someone's messing with me?" she asked. "Or is it just my nerves?" I didn't know what to say, but I kept telling her to just hang in there. I figured it was just one of those things where you move in, everything feels a little strange, and then after a while it all becomes normal. Except things didn't get normal. They got worse. A few days later, she called me up again, and this time, she sounded more rattled than before. She told me her front door had been slightly open that morning, even though she was absolutely sure she had locked it the night before. I told her it was probably just the latch, that old houses have quirks like that, but she cut me off saying, "No, it's not the door. There's other stuff too." Apparently, she'd been finding small things out of place around her house. Nothing big at first, just little things. A mug she didn't remember using sitting on the counter. The bathroom cabinet left open. Lights flickering in a way she hadn't noticed before. "Maybe I'm just forgetful," she said, "but it's like, I don't know, things feel off. Like I'm in someone else's space, not my own." I try to keep her calm, but even I was starting to feel a bit uneasy listening to her. I mean, she's an organized person. She's not the type to leave things lying around, and she definitely wouldn't leave her door unlocked. But I told her to try to relax, maybe get some rest. Sometimes stress does weird things to people. Well, that night, she texted me just after midnight. She'd looked out her bedroom window and saw a shadow in the yard. She said it was too dark and too rainy to make out any details, but she could tell it was a person, someone tall, standing just beyond the light from her porch. I could almost hear her voice shaking through her text as she wrote, "What should I do?" I told her to stay inside, lock the doors, and call the police, but by the time she got the courage to go back to the window, the figure was gone. All she could see was the rain, glistening on the grass where he had been. But after that, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. She tried to brush it off, but every night, the same thing happened. That light across the street kept blinking in sync with hers. She'd look out her window and catch faint, shadowy movement in the rain, always just out of clear view. It was like someone was watching her, and I could tell it was wearing her down. Finally, she decided to put up a few security cameras around the house. She figured it would help her get some peace of mind, maybe even catch whoever or whatever was making her feel this way. The next night, she stayed up late watching the live feed, determined to catch any movement. But each time she checked, there was nothing. Just empty rain-soaked lawns, the occasional flash of lightning, and those dim lights flickering across the street. Then, at 3:15 a.m., all the cameras went dark. She texted me, panicked, saying all the feeds had just gone out, all at the same time. She tried resetting them, but they wouldn't come back on. Eventually, she fell asleep, exhausted, and figured maybe it was just a technical glitch. But when she checked the footage the next morning, there was nothing to see. All the recordings had corrupted at exactly 3:15 a.m., like something had intentionally cut them off. She tried to shake it off as a random issue, but I could tell it was getting to her. She stopped sleeping well, jumping at every sound, and she started asking me to come stay over, even though I lived hours away. One night, I was on the phone with her when she heard something strange, a faint, rasping sound coming from her closet. I told her it was probably just the house settling or something, but she swore it was breathing. I told her, "Karen, take a deep breath. You're probably just hearing things." But then she said, in this quiet voice, "I can feel it though. It's like someone's here with me." She went quiet for a minute, then whispered, "Should I look?" I told her no, to just leave it alone and try to sleep, but she couldn't. The next day, she told me she'd spent half the night staring at the closet, waiting for something to happen. She said it felt like it was pulsing, like it was holding some dark, waiting energy. But of course, nothing happened. Just another night of paranoia, she figured. But things kept getting weirder. The next night, she found muddy footprints in her hallway, leading from her closet to her bedroom door. And the thing was, the footprints were wet, like someone had just walked through the rain. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, or maybe she'd tracked in mud without realizing it. But the prints were big, and they were definitely not from her own shoes. That was when she called me, begging me to come over. I couldn't get there until the next evening, and when I finally arrived, I could see right away that something had changed. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days, and the house felt cold and damp, almost oppressive. She told me that the previous night had been the worst yet. She'd woken up around 3 a.m. to the sound of soft breathing again, but this time it was louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was standing right next to her bed. And that's when she told me about the notebook. She'd found it that morning, hidden in the back of her closet behind a loose board. It was filled with notes, all in messy handwriting, documenting her every move since she'd moved in. Entries like, "She's up late tonight. Good?" Or, "Watched her through the rain." She seemed to notice. The most recent entry, dated the night before, read, "Tonight, I'll finally meet her." She looked at me, her face pale, and said, "I think someone's been in my house every night since I got here." We took the notebook to her neighbor the next morning, hoping for some kind of explanation. But when we tried to show him, the notebook was blank. Every single page. And that hidden compartment in her closet? It was gone. After the notebook went blank, Karen's panic hit a new level. She was sure it had all been real, that she wasn't just making it up. She even started questioning herself, wondering if maybe she'd somehow imagined the whole thing. But that look on her face, I could tell she believed it, believed every moment of it. And I couldn't explain what I'd seen either. The house felt heavy, like it was holding on to some secret it didn't want to reveal. Karen decided she couldn't live there alone anymore, not after all of this. She packed up what she could and stayed with me for a few days while she tried to figure out her next move. But even then, it was like the house wouldn't let her go. Strange things kept happening around her. Small objects would go missing, only to show up in odd places, and sometimes she'd get these random phone calls with only static on the other end. Each time, the calls would come through at exactly 3:15 a.m. without fail. One night, a few days after she left Maple Hill, I was the one who heard it. Karen was asleep on my couch, and I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I heard what sounded like a faint tap 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 at my back door. At first, I thought it was just a branch, or maybe even the wind, so I ignored it. But then it came again, tap tap tap, only louder this time, more deliberate. I froze, straining my ears to hear anything over the rain pounding outside. But when I looked out the window, there was no one there. Nothing but darkness and the reflection of my own face staring back. That night, I didn't get a wink of sleep. The next morning, Karen woke up looking more drained than ever. She told me about a dream she'd had, a nightmare where she'd been back in that house on Maple Hill. She'd been walking down the hall, hearing that soft, rhythmic breathing from her closet. And as she got closer, the door had slowly creaked open, revealing that same gaunt, faceless figure she'd seen before, standing there, just waiting. She said it felt so real, like she could smell the dampness in the air and feel the coldness radiating from the figure's shadow. And then, she told me something that sent chills down my spine. I woke up, looked over at the couch, and for a split second, I saw him standing right there, watching me. I didn't know what to say to that. We were both exhausted, both on edge, and I started to wonder if maybe this was some kind of shared delusion, something we were both feeding into. I mean, how could any of this be real? And yet, that nagging fear in my gut kept telling me it was. The next day, she decided to go back to Maple Hill to get the rest of her things. She asked if I'd come with her, and I agreed, even though every fiber of my being told me to stay away from that place. When we pulled up to the house, it looked almost ordinary, nothing like the ominous, creepy house we'd built up in our minds. But as soon as we stepped inside, that familiar heaviness hit us both. We walked through the silent rooms, gathering her belongings as quickly as possible, but there was something different. The house felt empty, like it had been abandoned for years instead of days. Dust was already settling over everything, and the air was thick and stale. We moved quickly, not saying much, both of us eager to get out as fast as we could. But then, as we were almost done, Karen froze, her eyes fixed on her closet door. Did you open that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I turned to look, and sure enough, the closet door was slightly open. We both knew we'd closed it before, but there it was, ajar, like someone had left it waiting for us. Karen took a deep breath and walked over to the door, pushing it open slowly, like she was afraid of what she might find. I followed close behind, and as the door swung open, we both saw it. There, in the back corner of the closet, the hidden compartment was open again, and lying inside was the notebook. We just stared at it, neither of us daring to touch it. Finally, Karen reached in, her hands shaking as she lifted it out. She flipped through the pages, and this time, they weren't blank. They were filled with new entries, all scrawled in that same messy handwriting. The last entry, written just hours before, read, "I knew she'd come back. Tonight, I get to meet her one last time." Karen dropped the notebook, her face white as a sheet, and we bolted out of that house, leaving everything behind. We didn't stop running until we were outside, breathing heavily, soaked in the rain. We jumped into the car and drove away, not looking back, both of us shaken to the core. After that, Karen moved out of state, far away from Maple Hill, far away from everything that reminded her of that place. But every now and then, I'd get a call from her in the middle of the night. She'd hear strange sounds, or she'd wake up feeling like someone was watching her. And once, she told me that she'd found muddy footprints by her bedroom door, leading from the closet. And every single time, these things would happen at exactly 3:15 a.m. It was like Maple Hill hadn't let her go at all. Like whatever had been in that house was still watching her, still following her, even across states, across time, waiting for the night when it could finally meet her. Months passed, and Karen seemed to be settling into her new life. She was hundreds of miles away from Maple Hill, in a quiet little town where she barely knew a soul. She said the distance helped her feel like she could finally breathe again. She changed her number, deleted her social media accounts, and rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a nondescript building. Anything to stay off the radar. I kept in touch with her regularly. She seemed to be doing well, but every once in a while, she'd mention small, unsettling things. At first, it was little stuff like how sometimes she'd come home and feel like things were out of place. A chair pulled slightly away from the table. A book moved to a different spot on the shelf. She told herself it was just her imagination, that it was only paranoia lingering from her time in Maple Hill. But then, the nightmare started again. She'd call me in the middle of the night, voice trembling, recounting the dreams. They were always the same. She'd find herself back in that house, walking down the hallway toward her bedroom, where that figure would be waiting in the closet. She never saw its face, but she always felt its presence. Each time, the dream would end the same way. She'd wake up just as she reached the closet door, her heart racing, feeling like someone was there with her in the darkness. Then one night, Karen called me, completely panicked. She'd woken up around 3:15 a.m. to a strange sound coming from her closet, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wall. At first, she thought it was part of a dream, but as she lay there, frozen in bed, she realized it was real. She held her breath, too terrified to move, too afraid to turn on the light. The tapping grew louder, then suddenly stopped. She waited, her ears straining to hear anything in the silence. Just when she thought it was over, she heard it, a soft whisper, so quiet she almost missed it. "I found you." She scrambled out of bed, flipped on every light in the apartment, and stayed up until sunrise, too shaken to even think about sleeping again. She told herself it was just a nightmare, a leftover fear that had come with her from Maple Hill. But after that night, things only got worse. For weeks, the whispering continued. Always faint, always at 3:15 a.m. She'd be lying in bed, half asleep, when she'd hear it. Just a few words, whispered so softly she could barely make them out. Sometimes it was her name, other times just a low, drawn out, "I'm here." She was barely sleeping, living on edge, convinced that whatever had been in Maple Hill had somehow followed her across the miles, refusing to let her go. One night, she called me, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I think it's trying to drive me insane," she whispered, as though even saying it out loud would somehow make it worse. "I don't know how it got here, but I know it's real. I feel it watching me every night." I didn't know what to say. How could I help her when I didn't even know what it was? But I could hear her fear, her desperation, and I knew she wasn't making it up. I suggested she see someone, maybe talk to a therapist or a priest, but she just laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. What am I supposed to tell them? That something is following me? That a shadow is trying to get into my life? We talked for hours that night, trying to figure out what she could do, until eventually, she fell asleep on the phone. I stayed on the line, listening to her breathe, hoping she could finally find some peace. But just as I was about to hang up, I heard it, the faintest of whispers coming from her end of the line, almost like a static, but layered beneath it was something else, something chilling. "You'll see." It was so quiet I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but the hairs on my arm stood up, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just interference, some glitch in the connection, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was real. It had followed her, and somehow, I'd heard it too. The next morning, I called Karen, trying to convince myself that I'd been mistaken, that it had all been in my head. But when she answered, she sounded worse than ever. She told me she'd woken up to find muddy footprints by her bed, leading from the closet to the side of her mattress. She'd checked every window, every door. They were all locked, just as she'd left them. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside, and yet the footprints were there, as real as anything. At that point, she decided to leave. She couldn't stay there, not with this thing haunting her, day after day, night after night. She packed what little she had and left town, moving into a friend's place temporarily, hoping the distance would be enough to finally break free. But a few nights later, she called me again. "I think it's with me," she whispered, barely holding back tears. "I saw it tonight in the mirror. Just a glimpse, but it was there, right behind me. And when I turned around, there was no one." I didn't know what to tell her. This thing, whatever it was, seemed determined to stay with her, no matter where she went. It was like it had claimed her, like she was marked somehow, bound to it in a way neither of us understood. She talked about going to the police, maybe hiring a private investigator, but what could anyone do against something like this? In the end, Karen decided the only thing left was to confront it. She went back to Maple Hill, determined to find out what had happened, why this thing had chosen her, why it wouldn't leave her alone. She spent days in the empty house, searching for any clue, any hint of what had gone wrong, but found nothing. The house was silent, as though whatever had been there was gone, leaving only echoes and memories in its wake. But on her last night, just as she was about to give up, she found it, hidden in a crawl space beneath the floorboards, wrapped in layers of plastic, was an old, dusty notebook. She opened it to find pages filled with her own life, written out in meticulous detail. Her routines, her habits, her fears. The entries were dated, going back years before she'd even moved to Maple Hill. Someone had been watching her for a long time, long before she'd ever stepped foot in that house. And on the last page, scrawled in a shaky, almost frantic handwriting, was a single line. "You can't leave me. You belong to me now." This time, when Karen left Maple Hill, she didn't look back. She disappeared, going completely off the grid, leaving behind everything and everyone she'd ever known. The last time I heard from her, she was somewhere up north, in a cabin she'd rented under a false name. She sounded more at peace, finally free of whatever had been haunting her. But every now and then, late at night, I'd get a strange call, and there'd be nothing on the other end but static, with a faint whisper buried deep in the noise. I'd sit there listening, waiting, and every time I'd swear I heard it, the sound of soft breathing, just out of reach. And then, just before the line would go dead, that same chilling whisper, "See you soon." After that last unsettling call, I didn't hear from Karen for months. I tried not to think about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. It was like there was a ghost of Karen that hung around me, a shadow that lurked in the corner of my mind, always whispering that I should have done more. One evening, nearly a year after she had disappeared, I received an email. It was from an unknown address, but the subject line was unmistakable, from Karen. My heart pounded as I opened it, dreading what I might find. The message was short. "I think I'm safe here, but I'm not alone." That was it. Nothing else, just those 7 words. The phrase haunted me for days. I tried responding, but my emails bounced back. She deleted the account right after sending it. I couldn't help but imagine her out there, alone in some forgotten corner of the world, running from whatever had been following her all this time. Then, 3 days later, another email arrived. This one had an attachment, a video file. Hesitantly, I clicked on it, my stomach churning with unease. The video was grainy and dark, as if it had been filmed with an old, low-quality camera. I could barely make out Karen's face, illuminated only by the glow of her phone screen. She was whispering. Her voice was thin, fragile, and I had to turn up the volume just to catch her words. "I've tried everything," she said, glancing over her shoulder into the darkness behind her. "I thought I could escape. I thought I was safe. But it's here. It's always here." She looked back at the camera, eyes wide and desperate. "It doesn't matter how far I run. It doesn't matter how many times I change my name or where I hide. Every night, at 3:15 a.m., I hear it. The breathing, the whispering. Sometimes it's right next to me. Sometimes it's in the walls. I thought it was all in my head, that it would stop if I just kept moving. But it's real. It's real, and it won't stop." The screen went dark for a moment, but then it flickered back to life. Karen was staring into the camera, her expression hollow and defeated. "I found another notebook," she whispered. "It was in the attic of this place, hidden under the floorboards. It's just like the one in Maple Hill. Every page is filled with my name, my life, things that haven't even happened yet. It's like it's keeping track of me. It's waiting." She took a shaky breath, her eyes darting around the room. "There's something I have to tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something I didn't realize until now. This thing, this presence, it isn't just a stranger watching me. It's me, or a part of me that's twisted. I don't know how or why, but it's like I've become a ghost in my own life. The footsteps, the whispers, the muddy tracks. Sometimes I think I'm the one leaving them. I think I'm watching myself from the other side." The screen flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move behind her, a shadow, shifting in the darkness. Karen's eyes widened, and she leaned closer to the camera. "If you get this," she whispered, "if anything happens to me, promise me you'll remember this. I can't escape it, but maybe you can." Then the screen went black and the video ended. For weeks, I was haunted by that last image of Karen, her face pale and hollow, her eyes filled with a terror I couldn't begin to understand. I tried to find her, but every trail led to a dead end. It was as though she'd vanished completely, leaving nothing behind but that one cryptic message. Months passed. I thought about Karen every day, wondering if she'd finally found peace or if she was still out there, hiding from something no one else could see. And then, one night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was 3:15 a.m. The house was silent, but I could feel something, a presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I lay there, paralyzed, listening as the minutes ticked by, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against the wall. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, growing louder with each passing second. I forced myself to sit up, to reach for the light, but before I could turn it on, the tapping stopped. In the silence, I felt a cold breath against my cheek, and I heard a whisper, so close it was almost inside my head. "I found you." The next morning, I found a notebook on my nightstand. It was old, the pages worn and yellowed, and as I flipped through it, my blood ran cold. Every page was filled with my life, my routines, my habits, my fears, written in a messy, frantic scrawl. And on the last page, in large, bold letters, was a single line. "You belong to me now." I moved out that same day, desperate to leave, but no matter where I went, the tapping, the whispering, followed. It was as though Karen's curse had somehow passed on to me, binding me to whatever had haunted her. And now, every night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., I sit in the dark listening, waiting. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.